My talk today is, well, it's more of a chat. This is really very informal. I want it to be informal, and I want people to take it informally. I've been interested in the future of consciousness. I think there's some reason to think that there is a optimistic future of consciousness if we don't all ruin the world first. Let me see if I can put up my PowerPoint and see how well that works. First, I need to share screen. And I did send it to Jeffrey too, in case I have serious problems. He can run it from his end. Now, do you all see the picture of Ursula Le Guin? Is that okay? I just like Ursula. And I like this quote, so it's a good place to start. I'm interested in where consciousness could be going in the future, and interested in a non-Darwinian, non-neo-Darwinian view. There's so many ways to think about things changing over time. Not only the Darwinian and neo-Darwinian, Lamarckianism seems to be coming back, epigenetics. A lot of things are changing. I'm a big fan of Irvin Laszlo, dear friend. And can you see that okay? It doesn't cover my whole screen, but that doesn't matter if it looks okay for you. He basically, in his book, Intelligence of the Cosmos, makes a good argument that everything is moving towards higher levels of complexity and coherence. And we see this all over the place. And eventually that manifests in consciousness as well. And of course, T.R. de Chardin was thinking in these terms as well. I won't talk about him today, but he fits the picture. So I'm actually beginning to work with some other folks to put together a conference that will highlight ideas about the future of consciousness. Oh, it's going on its own, huh? And where am I here? Things running on its own. I'm going to go back one. And it'll take place maybe next year. But I'm interested in what there may be positive in the future if we don't ruin the world in the meantime, where we could be going and what it could mean to move towards more complexity and oneness. So, yeah, if we look at history, the evolutionary history, we see this increase in complexity and coherence. We see it in the cosmos as well. I had a bunch of slides about that, and I decided that wasn't really what my talk was about, so I'm not going into it, and I don't have a bunch of slides on the evolution of the human brain either, but you can find them if you like. But certainly there's an increase in complexity, increase in coherence. If just on the psychological, and I said this was basically an informal talk, but what's going on psychologically? Well, we're seeing a number of different models of human growth that seem to me to have something to do with the direction of consciousness as we go through history. We could talk about that more, but everybody knows about Maslow's needs hierarchy. Everybody doesn't know about his notion of self-transcendence, which was the last thing he was talking about and thinking about at the time of his more or less unexpected death. But self-transcendence goes beyond self-actualization, and ironically, some self-transcenders really are a bit neurotic and don't have everything else all solved. So that's a bit of a puzzle. Maslow was a bit bewildered by it, but he met these people that are selfless, gone beyond thinking about themselves, gone beyond self-actualization. There are other models, of course. This is Ken Wilber's, he really kind of worked with the spiral dynamics quite a bit. And Ken, as you know, is always talking about first tier and second tier consciousness, which he believes is coming along through history and through a kind of psychological evolution. The characteristics of second-tier consciousness is it can look down and see first-tier consciousness. That is, if you're second tier, you can see these other structures in other people and in your own history. We could spend a whole graduate program on this, but I don't intend to do that today. My idea of the best work on self-development and consciousness actually is Robert Keegan's work. You know, he really talks about the development of consciousness across human lifetime. And we start out sort of in the middle here with the socialized mind, but then that goes on to the self-authoring mind, which is a bit like self-actualization, and then the self-transforming mind. We could spend a lot of time talking about that too, but it's not my object today to talk about psychological models so much as to point out that a lot of people are thinking about these things. Ken Wilber's book from about 10 years back on integral psychology has tables of something like 20 or 30 models for psychological growth, including spiral dynamics and whatever ones that you might be familiar with. Okay, so I want to go from here and talk about possible future of consciousness. Excuse me, somebody is not muted themselves and having a conversation with their dog or something. If you could turn that off. So this is informal again. I'm just generating ideas. And if things go well, I'll have some time afterwards to talk. Okay, so let me go back one. This is about a 10-minute audio PowerPoint. So I'm going to let it run. It'll take about 10 minutes. Oh, and you may need to turn up your volume for this. We've had some volume problems in testing it at home here. That okay? Hear that okay?
I think you need to click the share audio button when you do the share.
Okay, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything either.
Oh, you're not hearing anything.
I think you stop sharing, then when you share, click the button at the left, which says bottom left, which says share audio. Share computer.
Did you hear
audio.
that, Leslie?
No, hear it again. Bottom left.
It says
First,
share
you have to
audio.
stop sharing. First, you have to stop sharing.
Okay, I've
And
stopped.
Okay, then start to share again. But before you click on the screen, in the lower left of that box, there's a pop-up box in the lower left that says share sound.
Oh, you know, I tried this at home with 2 computers and it didn't work. So let's give it a try. Thank you. All right, let's go forward. So, yeah, keep going forward. One of the things I'm very interested in, and thumbs up, can you hear that? Been relatively little work done on, although
Yeah,
people
we
have
can hear
talked about it.
Great.
Is the idea that under certain circumstances, our conscious processes overlap or connect in some kind of intimate way. People have studied this through, for example, telepathy and psychic research. But I want to just emphasize the idea that people that we're intimate with, psychologically close to, sometimes break through into a single kind of conscious experience. And that's what I'm calling intersubjectivity. There are groups of people working on this, and I'll talk about it more as we go along. There's a kind of parallel to this in the quantum world, as many of you know, what's called the Singlet State, in which if 2 particles come together in intimate association, they remain correlated in their activities from now on. And so there are lots of good stories about this. If these 2 electrons interact in the laboratory in Paris, for example, and then one goes to Alpha Centauri, their behavior remains correlated. I hate to use the word causality. People have said causality, they're causally connected, but that The word causal itself puts us back into the Newtonian universe, and that's exactly where we want to get out of right now. So they have properties, sometimes called colors or spin vectors, that are only meaningful in the laboratory, quantum research laboratory, but are correlated, and you can't change them. So once they come together, they form what's called a singlet state. This has been very well studied. It's not somebody's great idea, although it is a great idea. And it means these particles now are part of the same process. Well, this leads to some speculation. For example, keep in mind that at the time of the Big Bang, everything was together. So in some larger sense, everything in the universe is correlated and connected in this way. And the extent to which we have individual activity in separate particles and separate objects is up for grabs. But this is a real thing. And I think it makes a nice metaphor, if not a model, for what goes on in intersubjectivity when two people seem to experience something intimate together. Well, for example, the Quakers have what they call traditional Quakers, a gathered meeting, in which there's a real sense of connection. This is during a silent meeting, and one feels intimately part of everyone else in the room. Andrew Cohen and his people have worked on this and begun to develop it, so I'll talk about it more. But it seems like this sort of thing is occurring in different places to a greater extent. Talk to jazz musicians during improvisational sessions, and in some sense they become unified in this sort of way as well. Of course, the music's there, and the music's what brings people together, but I've talked to jazz musicians that were even at a distance and had this experience. So the idea of intersubjectivity, the idea that at least some of us, some of the time, are sharing the conscious field, it's sort of reminiscent of resonance is a very common physical feature of many objects, resonant objects that sort of oscillate together. For example, if you put a number of clocks in the same room together, they eventually begin to come into tune. If you put a group of women together in the same dorm, they come into synchrony too over a period of time. We see this kind of resonance going on all over the place, in which organisms and physical objects come into a kind of unified action together. So this idea of singlet atoms or singlet atomic particles is larger if we begin to think in terms of resonance and connection. It really is a larger process and one that's worth talking about. I like to think about this to some extent in terms of chaotic systems, fractals in particular, because we know complex fractal systems can come together and become unified and form more complex systems of fractals, and unite. So we might think in terms of consciousness as it's developing in the world today and in the future as leading to more and more complex interactions and structures that bring people together on a much larger scale. So that's one of the ideas that I really want to present here, is that we may be looking at a future in which individual separation is really not so absolute as we thought it was. William James, for example, said that the distance or the separation of the consciousness of two people sitting in the same room or sleeping in the same bed is absolute, the most fundamental breaches in nature. And I'm going to disagree with that, although I love James, and I think very highly of him. There are times when I certainly feel connected with other people, especially people that I'm intimate with emotionally. And I think the problem in part is that people experience it but don't really think about it or recognize it. And I suspect it happens most often when we're talking together and interacting. So we have physical world cues for it, and we often attribute the whole thing to those physical cues. What I'm suggesting is that in the future, if things go well, and of course if things don't go well, it's a whole other story, but that we'll see more and more of these kinds of events, these kinds of comings together. They seem to arise out of communities of practice, especially meditative practice or contemplative practice, where people come together through music, through chanting, through meditation, and really produce a kind of higher, more unified consciousness. The interesting thing is this seems to be developing at an accelerating rate, as a friend of mine said. It seems to be going exponential. I don't know for sure whether that's true, but it's an interesting idea. Is there any an exponential acceleration of coming together at the subjective level through intersubjectivity, a dimension of experience we all live in all the time, but somehow haven't paid good attention to because we've been Newtonized in a sense. We live in this material world maybe a little bit too long every day. So there's a possibility in the future of seeing a more unified cosmos of living beings. Of course, this sort of thing is not limited entirely to human beings. It's just that we're kind of dumb. And perhaps, as Rupert Sheldrake has said, when we watch groups of organisms like flocks of birds or schools of fish or just other animals besides humans, that they seem coordinated to a tremendous degree. And this he attributes in part to morphic fields that they share. Well, that may be the answer for intersubjectivity as well. And because of our trip through our own human evolution, and especially through the recent few hundred years of reductionism, that we've sort of slipped out of gear, slipped out of notion for this. So that's one of the basic ideas I want to express. Okay, let's see if we can stop sharing. All right, well, here I am back again. Can you hear me? How's the sound doing? Hello?
Good, we hear you great.
Oh, great, thank you. Well, I'll just mention a couple of things in passing, but I just want to leave these as thoughts for the future. It turns out that very recently people have been doing EEG work. Maybe Jeffrey's been doing some of this, and I think Gina, we heard earlier today, also what's called hyperscanning or connecting people, EEG patterns of people who are interacting with each other. And they have a tendency to come into synchrony between lovers, good friends, and you can have control groups or control couples who don't know each other, and you don't get this synchrony. Of course, people have started looking at this thing a lot since the discovery of mirror neurons, and exactly why this happens or why the gamma area EEG, range EEG is coming into synchrony between people that are emotionally and intimately close, but not others. I think is up for grabs. Maybe it's morphic fields, who knows? But you can go on the web pretty quickly and Google hyperscanning. You can see a lot of studies. I was going to have some pictures, but basically they're pictures of people with EEG electrodes on their heads talking to each other. But it's pretty impressive, and they're experiencing a kind of, I believe, intersubjectivity. There was a book written about 10 years ago. I don't really check the name of the author, but it's called First Sight. And the author argues through the whole book that we are really are submerged in psychic connections with each other all the time. But these connections take place usually in situations in which we're sitting together or making love or sitting in the car together. And there's just all kinds of reasons to attribute this intersubjectivity or this common experience to material signals, behavioral causes. So that's basically my talk. I just I'll leave it open a little bit now and see if anybody has any comments or anything, or just encourage you to think about this idea for the future, as it were. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Leslie. We have about 6 or 7 minutes probably for questions.
Or we can,
Guy, do you have a question? You're muted. I can't.
I have a comment and a question.
All right, go for it.
Yeah, so Leslie,
Alton or Neil, I
this
see
is
your
great.
hands too, so we'll call on you next.
Can you hear me okay?
yeah, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Leslie.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was so fascinated that you're discussing this idea of collective consciousness. This is very much kind of the work our university, the Maharishi International University, does, and we have over 15 publications. There is a book also called The Field Paradigm. Actually, it's available for free also, PDF, and can download The Field Paradigm. And it shows about 40 experiments done, large-scale experiments where this sort of phenomenon works. The missing element is the mechanics of it, right? So that's why this whole idea is a paradigm being promoted. And there's always this question of how do we test this paradigm? Electromagnetic field, of course, we can't see, but we can measure it. Gravitational field, we know we can't see it, but we can measure it. The consciousness field, we know we can't see, but we can measure the effect, just like what you're describing. People want to know what the mechanics of it is. Is that a fair question even for them to ask, or should we say, go take a hike? Do you ask how the electromagnetics, field works on or something?
Well, I always thought Rupert Sheldrake, who I've known for many years, was very smart in not trying to explain what morphic fields are in terms of physics or anything else. He just talks about their effects. And I think this is one of those things. We see the effect, we experience it. And, we've been so Newtonized that if you can't explain it in terms of the conservation of energy or something, they say, well, it must not be real. But, if you look at the phenomenon, it's real enough. And so thank you if you post that book into the chat. I definitely will go get it. This is an area I'm just kind of exploring myself. I'm not claiming to be a real expert, so I'm so happy to have your input. And I know you folks. Who is it there at the university? I was there for a
David
conference
Johnson. David
Johnson. Some of that research is wonderful stuff, really good stuff. So I'm glad that, and you've got field effects that have.
That's right.
And he's had trouble publishing just because people don't want to believe it. Well, I think of my friend Rupert again in his book, The Science Illusion, or The Science whatever it is. And, there are these facts that we just take for granted. One of them is the conservation of energy. Well, it was a great idea when Helmholtz came up with it. And it turns out to be very useful in physics, but who's ever proved it? It's just a good idea, and yet we believe all these things. So, thank you. You got me going, didn't you? Thank you. That was
Alton. I think you were next.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, Alan, I'm curious, if I applied these principles perfectly through my life, how do I move through the world differently?
Well,
for the next 24 hours.
Yeah, you you focus on loving people around you, and being close to them, and yeah. You know, I don't really have principles here, but what we're saying is really underneath, and it seems to be coming out all over, is that we really are social creatures in more than trivial ways, that we're close to each other. If we don't end up wrangling and arguing, we have much in common. And we experience each other, I think, closely. So
I'm definitely
yes.
agreeing. I mean, I've started a 12-bedroom community home to do that exactly. And then so how might it look in conversations or knowing that?
Yeah.
So wondering
Well,
how.
the EEG data that's coming out shows that people that are intimate or good friends or in love or those sorts of things really come into this gamma level synchrony when they interact with each other. So it's something quite real, as a matter of fact. And it's just kind of gotten over into the neurological laboratory, I think, through the venue or through the pathway of mirror neurons, which sort of opened up the whole issue of whether people that are near each other or other animals as well are somehow sharing mirror neuron activities. Well, it turns out it's a lot more than that, and I think it's a whole new area. So
Let's
it's
try
gonna
for
be up
one
to you to
more.
figure it out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andre. Thank you, Alton.
I'm unmuting. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, now I'm interested. It's obvious that any kind of interaction is going to be, you know, something that is action at a distance. But, you know, we still need a mechanism for receiving. And that mechanism for receiving, it occurs to me, is likely to be more of a Newtonian physics setup.
Well, I disagree with that. Why do you think it has to be
let me just say what I mean. For instance, you know, a receiver for a particle or something like that. You're talking about something that may be electromagnetic or something like that may receive. Now, I've had experiences myself with what it feels like to have a 10 Tesla magnet around your in your head when you move in it. And I've also experienced, you know, head-to-head, very strong telepathic experiences. And the movement that you experience inside your head feels very similar. It feels like a current moving when you've got a strong magnetic field. It's very, very similar. And so I just wondered, you know, to what extent there's possible that there are some ways that you can get a more in a laboratory, getting a more Newtonian result through proximity or so on, where well, you know, your main effect. I know that they've had things with sort of cows where they're widely separated.
Yeah, if you'll excuse me, I'll answer. Stephen Schwartz has done experiments with telepathy in which people have gone down a submarine so deep that electromagnetic connections just simply aren't possible, and it doesn't affect it at all. Works perfectly well.